Hello and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And today I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Amber X. Chen. Amber, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And, just a little bio so people can get to know you a little. You're a freelance journalist from Southern California, and your work focuses primarily on environmental justice issues. And you've contributed to some great places, Atmos, Teen Vogue, Protocol, the Los Angeles Times, and others. And you work with journalism to introduce equitable climate solutions and diversify the media landscape. So really perfect kind of stuff for this podcast. And in particular, I learned about your work from a piece that you published, pretty recently. That would have been just a little over a week ago, I think, that came out. And it's called Tripping for the Planet, Psychedelics and Climate Activism. And it's a really great piece, and I want to chat with you about it. But first, I'm curious about your work with environmental justice. Journalism for environmental justice, such a noble cause. But how did you get into that? I'm always really curious how people get into any kind of environmental work.
So I had been sort of like an environmental activist all throughout high school. So yeah, I guess in high school when I started, I was very like social justice-y. I was like in youth in government, and I was, like I was at this like city council meeting in my city. We were like advocating for like an increase in the minimum wage. And then after that meeting, I sort of like we were like talking amongst ourselves, like the people who had attended the meeting, and one of the people there was at the time the director of my city's Natural Resources and Environmental Commission, and they were looking for a youth commissioner. And I was like, I would love to be a youth commissioner. So me and then I looped in my friend Max, and me and Max, we both became youth commissioners for our city. And yeah, and so I just did like a bunch of local environmental organizing all throughout high school. And then the summer before my senior year of high school, I got in contact with this like big international nonprofit called Plastic Pollution Coalition. And from there, I was introduced to like this very like big international like range of like environmental activists, and I started to connect with them. And sort of at this time, I was like, I guess like I was reading a lot about environmentalism, and specifically I read an article by Hop Hopkins in the Sierra Club magazine about, how racism was at the root of a lot of our environmental problems and the climate crisis. And I think that's sort of like how that was like one of the reasons why I became passionate about environmental justice. Um, and then I just started, like networking with environmental activists more. And then I started blogging for an environmental justice like digital platform. And that also introduced me to a lot of environmental justice and made me more like passionate about environmental justice. And then I started freelancing. And so that's sort of like how that transpired. Yeah.
Nice. That's great. That's cool that you got into it in high school, really. I had a different experience of high school. I was mostly playing video games, I think. I read a book. There was some, once maybe, but it took me a little while longer to really get into that kind of, engaged environmental concern. Like if you would have asked me, like, do you like breathing clean air? I would have said yes. But that kind of engagement, yeah, that's great to get into it in high school. And freelancing to me especially seems particularly scary because it's just you out there, just submitting stuff and just, kind of connecting on your own. The umbrella of academia is very different. But one of the things I really appreciate about your work is precisely as a freelance journalist, you're able to get the word out to so many interesting venues. And Teen Vogue is one of those. I'm like, man, if I could ever write for Teen Vogue, I feel like I'd be reaching such a cool audience.
Oh my God, I
Um,
literally pitched Teen Vogue like 7 times before I finally
all right.
landed something with them. Like it's just a lot of rejection. Mhm.
That's good. That's good advice for people who are getting into it. It's like get used to the rejection
Yeah,
and
sure.
just yeah, be patient, have some perseverance. Yeah, that's great. Well, so one of the places that you've published a few things in is Atmos. And for people who aren't familiar with that, it's, like an online environmental magazine, really about climate and culture. So lots of cool pieces coming out there. And so that's where I saw this piece last week called Tripping for the Planet, Psychedelics and Climate Activism. I liked the title, first of all, because Tripping for the Planet, that's a great title. And also the juxtaposition of psychedelics and climate activism. I think people would think that's no way that those things have anything to do with each other. And there's, on first blush, people who don't like study psychedelics and things, they'd be like, what? How does this? So I really like the way you unpack that throughout the piece. I guess before we get into that, maybe we should just say what psychedelics even are. I think there's plenty of people who are very familiar with it. Anybody who studies it or has had psychedelic experiences might know some of the story. But other people might be just, it's just a word to describe some drugs or something. So yeah, if you could say a little, what are psychedelics? What's the psychedelic experience?
Yeah, so there is, I guess, a little debate like amongst people who study psychedelics about what exactly psychedelics are. I know some people want to just like rein it into classic psychedelics, which from what I remember from my research, are psychedelics that like specifically act on like the five HT2A serotonergic receptors. I think that's like the terminology for it. But I got to speak with this like great professor, Zach Walsh. I believe he's at the University of British Columbia. I might have to double check that, but he told me that like how he would define psychedelics and how I guess like most would define psychedelics is just like anything a substance that can like give you a sort of like hallucinogenic experience or like a psychedelic experience, and like obviously then characterizing that psychedelic experience can also be a bit difficult, but I guess like how he described a psychedelic experience, it would just be like anything that sort of like invokes, like sort of like it could be characterized as hallucinogenic, but also psychedelic experience could be just be like heightened senses or like, stuff like that. It's quite broad, but stuff that I guess a lot of people would characterize as psychedelics include like drugs I'm sure many people have heard about, like MDMA could be characterized as a psychedelic, LSD, psilocybin or magic mushrooms. But then also these like sacred plant medicines like ayahuasca and peyote, etc. And as I mentioned in my article, there is a lot of pushback to call these sacred plant medicines psychedelics and to group them under psychedelics, or use the term psychedelics to label them or refer to them, because I guess like these like indigenous people are, from my interviews, are don't want to be associated with sort of like the psychedelic movement, and that term psychedelics that was more coined in like the 1960s.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because it is such a contested category. And I don't know what the classic psychedelics would probably just be like LSD, mushrooms, like ayahuasca and peyote. Those were the things that were grouped. And I like the idea, well, maybe MDMA is, or maybe cannabis can have psychedelic effects. It can really be pretty broad. And then you hear people being like, oh, no, no, don't call my sacred plant medicine psychedelic. And
Mm-hmm.
that whole story, it's like, people mostly think of, you say psychedelics, yeah, they think of like the 60s. And for indigenous communities, they're like, yeah, we've been doing this for a long time. It didn't start in the 60s. And in fact, when it got popularized in the 60s, it was kind of ripping off indigenous communities in a lot of ways and not giving them proper credit. So that's when we start to get a little bit more into some of the justice issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess before we get into a little bit more about psychedelics, because I don't know, I'm not sure about the audience for this podcast. I think some people are pretty familiar, some folks not so much. And so some people might just associate with the 60s, but there's been something like a psychedelic renaissance lately. And so I wonder if you could say a little about research into like the therapeutic benefits and things like that, including that pro-environmental behavior is somehow correlated with the psychedelic experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess like you know, we had this whole like psychedelic boom and drug boom in like the 60s and 70s, right? If you sort of like look at that history, and then immediately following that was this like massive war on drugs. That still continues to this day, but I think now when we talk about the psychedelic renaissance, people are starting to like become more accepting of sort of like incorporating these drugs, plants, medicines into their lives. And so there have been a lot of studies that have come out that sort of like point to the therapeutic potential of a lot of psychedelic substances. And so that's like one aspect of like why this renaissance is happening and like what is so enticing about this like new psychedelic renaissance. But on the other hand, some people have also been exploring the idea of like maybe psychedelics could not only help you, I guess, feel better like on a personal level, but maybe they could like help you become more like environmentally inclined. And so that's like the main thing that I was sort of like exploring in this article. It's like, what if psychedelics have more like than just therapeutic potential? Like, what if they could sort of like change our minds and like make us more environmentally inclined and make us, you know, care about the environment more and engage in more like environmentally progressive actions?
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable to me. And I've heard some stories from, some really prominent environmental activists. Sometimes it's public knowledge, sometimes it's just things people have said to me privately. And there's some often a psychedelic experience in there for a lot of people. So it's interesting to know that like the research is kind of bearing that out. That even the research is saying, yeah, it turns out you have these experiences, you come out of it and you see trees differently, you think differently about like animals or your place on the planet or in the universe. So yeah, really interesting. And yet, there's also some downsides. I like in the article, I like that you bring up, some of the problems that can happen with psychedelic experiences. And you bring up like the QAnon shaman guy, for instance. So I wonder if you could say a little about that, because all of a sudden it's hard to be so optimistic about it when you see some of the kind of dark side.
I guess the point is that like there's a lot that we don't know. And I think people are really quick to like attach themselves to psychedelics as like, wow, like look at this magical solution because like people are really desperate for climate solutions, you know, given the state of like the current climate crisis. And so when we talk about like psychedelics potentially inducing pro-environmental behaviors, and you know, anecdotally, there are a lot of like instances of you know people becoming saying that they become more environmentally inclined after psychedelics or people starting movements after psychedelic experiences. I use the example of Gail Bradbrook and Extinction Rebellion in my story. Um, but you know, then again, these studies are so preliminary, and so it's difficult to say like did psychedelics cause these, is this just like or it's really just like a compelling correlation that has been found so far, but we don't know. There's so many we don't know. There's so much we don't know, like we don't know like what psychedelics would be best for this. We don't know like how
Right.
much someone would have to take, like what environmental behaviors this would be, or yeah, there's just so much we don't know. And then of course there's the right wing aspect. Like so much of like psychedelic lore is based on I believe is based on like an association with the 60s and 70s as this countercultural, super progressive movement. And obviously like people are like historically known to have done a lot of drugs during this time. And so I do think that like a lot of us have sort of like internalized that and held on to that notion that like psychedelics are something that's inherently progressive, and that's not necessarily the case. As I point out, for example, psychedelics do have like quite a prominent history with the right wing, especially in recent times with the Q and Chen. Um, and yeah, like right wing neo-Nazis have been known to use psychedelics as well. Like the founder of the Daily Stormer, like he used psychedelics all throughout high school too. So like who's to say that psychedelics make one more progressive or environmentally conscious, you know?
Man, that's so tricky. Because it is that sort of thing, like Extinction Rebellion is a good example. And somebody's like, well, here's what caused me to do it. Like, well, you might feel that, but it might not have been the cause. It might have just been like a moment in your life that kind of solidified some things and helped remind you of some things you cared about. But yeah, really hard to say what's causing this. And then when you see people who are like, oh yeah, I got really into Nazism on psychedelics, like, wait, what? I
Yeah.
especially like your point, like, wait, which psychedelics would be was like, okay, take, 100 micrograms of LSD or something, or take a few grams of mushroom. That no mushrooms will do it because they're from the earth. Like, yeah, maybe, maybe not. And the fact that, yeah, I mean, QAnon shaman, it lends itself to conspiratorial thinking for some people.
Mhm.
So it's like, what do these substances even do? It seems like it's just unlimited possibility.
Yeah, I think Dr. Brian Pace, who I interviewed for this story, really explained it very well. He talked about psychedelics as magnifiers of consciousness that sort of like act on sort of like what's in your environment already. So I guess like in the context of, people like the Daily Stormer founder, I guess like that those are the ideas he had around him. And so it's not necessarily like psychedelics make you more progressive, but they sort of just like I guess act on your surroundings already. But yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me, a really prominent psychedelic researcher, Stanislav Grof. He had this thing. It was like psychedelics are to the study of the mind, kind of like what the microscope was for chemistry and what the telescope was for astronomy. And so it's
Mhm.
just that, it's just a magnifier. And so then if you have kind of problematic stuff in your mind and in your setting, then it's just going to enhance that in some ways. And that means in the right context, if you have some pro environmental inclinations, then it could magnify those. But if you also just hate the environment or you want to control things or be very authoritarian, then it'll just magnify that. Uh, so, yeah, that's very complicated. And this might be one of the reasons that indigenous traditions might want to say, don't bring us into this, because they have context where they know how to use it in a way that benefits people, and they don't get involved in the whole kind of mess of like the 60s and 70s, the war on drugs. Um, so I like that, a big part of what you're saying in the piece is that however we move forward with psychedelic research, we really need to start centering indigenous voices more. So I
Mhm.
wonder if you could say a little bit more about how indigenous perspectives come into this. Especially, I know some of your other work also engages with indigenous perspectives aside from psychedelic issues.
I think um just from the people I interviewed from my article for my article, like I'd say that it's more of like it's a conservation issue for a lot of indigenous people, like for example, like peyote. This is a plant that only grows in a very specific part of the world and it's already in very limited numbers. And so they're very wary about like introducing peyote to the general public outside of their own indigenous communities, just because like there is a huge risk for exploitation there. And I think it's very difficult. Like, we shouldn't be generalizing all Indigenous peoples, obviously. Like, there are some groups of Indigenous people who, like, I'm sure are very willing to share their plant medicines that have psychedelic properties with us. But then again, we have to, like, keep it on a very, like, I guess, case by case basis and really just, like, talk to the specific tribes who work with these plant medicines the most on, what they want and what they like what their wants and needs are and to respect those wishes of theirs. I think that's really just like the main point.
Yeah, and such an interesting kind of flip that, we think, oh, the research is saying that psychedelics promote pro-environmental behavior. But then what you're saying about peyote, for instance, is like, but taking the psychedelics is harmful to the environment. You're depleting this amazing plant, this cactus. Is
Mhm.
that a similar situation with ayahuasca?
I think I can't really say specifically like what the case with ayahuasca is. I remember from my interviews that the people of the Amazon who work with ayahuasca are pretty willing to share ayahuasca with people. There's psychedelic tourism to experience ayahuasca. That is sort of like a thing, and psychedelic tourism, I guess, is something else we could explore another time. But yeah, but the thing is like where the two um the two plants that make up ayahuasca are in the Amazon, like the Amazon in general is just being subject to so much deforestation. So definitely there is a conservation aspect into that too.
Right, right. Yeah, say more about psychedelic tourism or ayahuasca tourism. It's such an interesting phenomenon, and definitely something back in the 60s, you couldn't be so open about it, because of, war on drugs. It was pretty a harsh situation. People these days will just like post on Instagram, like I'm going to Peru and gonna take ayahuasca, and you can be pretty open about that stuff. So what is psychedelic tourism?
Um, I guess I'd say psychedelic tourism is when people like go to indigenous, like the origins of the psychedelic substance and experience it there. Like you'll see a bunch of things obviously like on social media where it's like I'm going to an ayahuasca retreat or stuff like that. And so that's sort of like what psychedelic tourism would be. And I didn't really explore this too much in the final version of the story, but it was definitely a part of my research process, but really questioning like, if psychedelic tourism becomes a source of income for a lot of indigenous communities that have been economically oppressed by like richer countries for so long. Um, it gets tricky to sort of like say like, do they really want us to be using their plant medicines or do they really just need like the money? And I guess we just have to be like really careful there because um we really want to make sure that like they want to do this out of their own free will, not because they need money. And it would be like it's such a shame that to think that they'd have to give up their cultural traditions to get money to survive. Like that is such a shame. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And they're like, oh, yeah, come down. We'll hold retreats for you. And then you're like, oh, do you really want to do this? They're like, no, we just know that we can get money from the north this way. Yeah, so it might, yeah, I'm sure there's some people who are like, no, we're really trying to spread the knowledge of what these medicines can do. And other people are like, I'm just really trying to make some money. Um, yeah, so I mean, the responsibility for people who are interested in these experiences, they need to be thinking about the communities they're impacting. I'm not sure how many are. That would be something. Hopefully, you do more research on that, and we can talk about it another time. Because I'm curious how that industry works. It seems like there's going to be some good and some bad. Some communities are probably being pretty exploited, and I also wonder about the experiences that people are having. I like are the tourist experiences very conducive to pro-environmental behavior, or would that be one of those things that's like, no, that doesn't necessarily stick because people are just having an exotic experience. It's hard to
I
say.
don't know. It's hard to
Yeah,
say. I guess
yeah,
it'd be really difficult to do a study on that too. Like it's
yeah,
very difficult to do a cause and effect study about
yeah.
psychedelics. Yeah.
That seems to be the thing, right? Yeah, there's so
Yeah.
many studies coming out, and after all is said and done, in terms of cause and effect, we're still just not sure.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think that's like why it's we can't treat psychedelics as like a climate solution, really, because like there is just like so much like we don't know. And like I guess like the main thing I bring up in my piece is like a critique of sort of like the way people are still like very much holding on to psychedelics as this like very magical substance that can just be like very flexibly applied to like all of society's ills. And that's just not a very like sustainable way to like think about solving society's problems, especially the the environmental crisis and environmentalism, like as a movement, is not something that should be hinged upon psychedelic substances. It should be like a movement that's built on like grassroots organizing. And it's like very hard, like structural systemic work. That's not, that doesn't equate to, a lot of people tripping. You know what I mean?
yeah, that's a good way to put it. And in a way, the kind of big enthusiasm for psychedelics is just bypassing the hard work, like organizing, just the political struggle of getting along with other people, figuring out how to get our society on the right track. If you're like, ah, that sounds hard. What if we just gave mushrooms to everybody? You're like, that might not be the solution.
And like, how would we even like figure that out? Like, how could we give mushrooms to everyone? Like, that's just like I don't think that's like possible. Possible.
Yeah, right. It would just be a thing that I don't know, everybody has to do in high school or something. It's part of the curriculum, and then everybody's tripping. Like, oh, that might have some adverse effects, especially seeing. I mean, like you're saying, the founder of the Daily Stormer and right wing, authoritarian kind of personalities are like, yeah, I tripped in high school, and look what happened to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, the idea of giving it to everybody, and I've heard people say, like, oh, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine, and they're like, if you gave Putin ayahuasca,
Yeah, it's like, no, that's not how it
Problem.
works.
Like if only politics was just so easily solved
By
by taking some,
psychedelics.
yeah.
Yeah.
And-
Make the entirety of Congress just trip.
yeah,
Like, what am I trying to
exactly.
say?
Oh, I can't imagine. That's a kind of, it'd be maybe a funny piece of fiction to write, but I wouldn't want to see it actually play out.
Yeah, me neither. Me neither.
Uh, well, yeah, I wonder then, so, do you see much of a positive role, or is it kind of like take it or don't take it, but the main thing we have to be focusing on are real political struggles?
I think I really do see. I know we talked a lot about sort of like how much we don't know and like what some downsides could be, but like I really do see a lot of positives that psychedelics could bring to people, especially like people in the environmental movement. Even the researchers on psychedelics in the right wing, like when they talked to me, they were like, but yeah, like there is potential here. There's potential that should be explored and researched more. Like I really do feel like the war on drugs was like wrong to sort of like take a lot of these substances away from us and classify them and just make them so inaccessible to the general public. Like I really do think, you know, uh, a lot of psychedelic substances should be available for people. And, like that wouldn't be too harmful. But then again, like when we talk about like decriminalization and legalization, we really need to like be careful again about like the indigenous plant medicines and yeah, it's very, I guess, like specific to the substance, like what we do and like what can we decriminalize, what can we legalize, like how can we build a conservation ethic into decriminalization. Like I'm really not talking about we need full-fledged decriminalization of all substances that could be classified as psychedelics like right now, because that just wouldn't play out well. Like we have no conservation ethic built into the stuff we do. Like we have no uh like ethic of like respecting culture is really built into like any of our systems at all. And so I guess there's just so much to think about. There's so much to think about like how even we would like put a lot of things on the market because, like if you look at how like psychedelics are like being distributed now, I guess like on a preliminary scale, a lot of it is through like very like inaccessible like psychedelic therapies within that are like guided by psychiatrists and like cost like $15,000. That's not like necessarily like making psychedelics accessible to a lot of people, but yeah, I guess like leave it to the experts. I do think people should talk about it more and explore psychedelics more.
Yeah, right. I think that's one of the harmful things from the war on drugs is it just shut down research, so people weren't able to study it in any kind of like proper context, and so we weren't talking about it in ways we could learn more, and so now we're kind of starting over now and trying to talk about it. But then, like you said, it's like yeah, but then it gets sucked into the system that's prohibitively expensive, and it just becomes like something for elites who can afford these kind of fancy therapies. So I wonder where you're at with that. Like, should if we're decriminalizing slowly and while building like the proper ethical contexts for it, could you imagine a situation where people could just get these substances on their own without a kind of licensed therapist or some kind of, official guide? Or if we're going to do it, do we have to have a therapist do it? Because then the price comes in, it's expensive, and
I genuinely don't know. Like I think the people who are like experts in that field should like explore that. But then again, like if you think about like these therapies, I guess that's only really a big issue in the United States because of how much medical care costs here.
right.
So I guess you could bring in therapy really shouldn't be that expensive, but it is just because of like the United States healthcare system.
Right.
So I guess like if we fix the healthcare system here, that wouldn't be that big of an issue. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, though. That is a uniquely American problem, uh, and and a good point because you're really pointing out the fact that if these substances are going to be beneficial to like the environmental movements or climate activism, we have a lot of other work to do first, including like fixing the healthcare system.
Hmm.
So when people are like, oh, we can include psychedelics in our healthcare system, it's like, yeah, but it's a broken healthcare system. How much is that going to do? I wonder how you think we could build more of a conservation ethic that would, so that when people are experiencing psychedelics, that they have that kind of background. What,
Um,
you know,
like when we talk about the conservation ethic, that's like to like the indigenous communities that are safeguarding these plant medicines. And like then again, I think it goes just back to like the principle of like listening to these communities and what they want to do, and supporting organizations that are working for the conservation of these plant medicines, like the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative. I think that's like what it's called. That's like a great organization that's working on the conservation of peyote. Because like if we're going to be expressing interest in these plant medicines, we should work on, like planting them and taking care of them. And yeah, just really just listening to Indigenous communities. That's really just what it comes back down to.
yeah, that's such a simple kind of point, but so complicated in terms of what that would actually look like. Because obviously, people aren't listening to indigenous communities about all kinds of issues about, land management, caring for uh, land back initiatives, and things like that.
Mhm.
So yeah, I like that as an overall frame for thinking about psychedelics. Is maybe a little less talking, a little more listening. And so far, the psychedelic renaissance that people refer to has really just centered the scientific community and therapy, and we don't hear that much about these indigenous voices.
Mhm.
So I wonder, who are there any other indigenous folks that you were interviewing for this piece?
Yeah, so I interviewed Stephen Benelli of the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, and I also interviewed Sutton King, who's this amazing entrepreneur. And yeah, they were great. They were great to talk to. I think Sutton King like really like uh talked a lot about, like the importance of like really listening to indigenous communities, and the importance of like making sure that the wealth gets back to indigenous communities too, if we're going to be using these substances.
Right. How did they feel about classifying these substances as psychedelics? Were they really emphasizing the plant medicine terminology? Were they okay with the language of psychedelics?
They're definitely emphasizing the plant medicine terminology. Yeah. But I guess I'm using the term psychedelics now just to like refer to like what we would classify as like substances that give you psychedelic experiences. But yeah, they really do emphasize using the term plant medicine. From what I remember, like for them, it's more of like a respect thing.
Yeah, that puts you in a tough situation because as a journalist reporting on this, like, well, I'm trying to honor their perspective, and at the same time, you're trying to study what the scientific community is saying, and the scientific community is like, we call those psychedelics. And indigenous people are like, we'd rather not, and so you're kind of stuck in the middle there.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I feel like I guess the scientific community I talk to still like acknowledge the plant medicine like distinction. But when it comes to just like using a term to just like because sometimes when you're like writing, you gotta like use a term that can talk about that can group things together.
Yeah.
And so I guess like that's when I just use the term psychedelics.
Yeah.
But yeah, it can be difficult like writing in like I guess layman's terms. I think it's more of like just like us as a general population, like definitely like use the term psychedelics to refer to like more things than we should.
Right, that's true. Like a psychedelic rock band or something. Like, well, that might not actually be a psychedelic experience from listening to that rock band. Maybe, maybe not. But yeah, it turns into like psychedelic art and things like that. Yeah, the word ends up getting applied really broadly. I
Yeah.
remember also people used to uh try to coin other terms, and one was entheogen, right? That it brings God within, entheos, the indwelling of God. And then for the most part, everybody's like, yeah, we're not going to call it that. So for some reason, the word psychedelic is really, really stuck.
Yeah. Yes. It's a cool word. I like it. It really rolls off the tongue.
Yeah.
Psychedelic.
And who coined that? You go over this a little bit in the article, right?
Oh my God, I gotta pull the article back
I
up.
think, yeah, I'll tell you, it's such a great article. And one of the reasons I was just like, oh, I have to reach out and see if you'll come on the podcast. And part of it is that it's not super long. It's it's got to be like what over 3,000 words, I think. And so it's something can be read in a relatively short period of time, but at the same time you're packing in so much information about like the history of psychedelics and therapeutic benefits, the pro-environmental behaviors, some of the dangers, indigenous communities. So yeah, it's really really a great piece. I can't say enough good things about it. And I've mentioned to you, before that I've already been sharing links with some students, because it's so important to be able to have this information in an easily digestible place. Otherwise, I don't know how people are learning about psychedelics these days. Like it's hard to read like scientific journals about it, and if you
Yeah.
do, you're going to miss the indigenous perspectives, and
Mhm.
hard to reach out to indigenous people if you don't know who's doing this kind of work. So yeah, you really pull quite a lot together. It's a really great piece.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much.
So yeah, did you find do you talk about who coined the term?
Oh my God.
I can't remember if that was in there. I know you talk about the history, getting back into stuff like in the 50s and 60s when people were first discovering this. But yeah, I can't remember because it is such a special word, and it has really just captured the public imagination.
So it was coined in 1957. I forget by who. Who coined the term psychedelics?
He was one of those guys. It wasn't Albert Hoffman, was it?
It was Humphrey Osmond.
Humphrey
Humphrey
Osmond,
Osmond.
right? Yeah, that's like a trivia question. Who was the guy who coined the term psychedelic?
It's like after researching this for like 6 months, I still just like don't remember parts of my article.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I appreciate you being open about that because I don't know any academic writer who would know everything that's in their writing. I know I don't. You pick up something I wrote and you're like, hey, what was in here? I'm like, I paid attention when I was writing it and I
Yeah,
remember the overall point, but a lot of the specifics kind of get lost. I mean, that's the point of writing it down, right? So you don't have to just remember it and say it from memory.
exactly, exactly.
And did you finish writing this a while before it came out?
I finished writing this, uh, I guess the last edits were put in the Friday before it came out. So no, I
Oh,
didn't.
okay.
Yeah, it got published like pretty quickly after I finished writing it.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I always wonder about that because I'm not in the world of journalism or freelance writing, and that's nice to be in a situation where you can kind of have a message and it gets out immediately instead of
It
having to.
definitely was like a really long time coming though, because I initially pitched this like I think late July, early August, and so
Hmm.
I'd been working on it sort of like all semester. Yeah.
That's good. That's a good chunk of time to work on just something that's that size. Was
Mhm.
that your intention initially to write it about that length? Were you trying to do something longer, something shorter, and just turned into this?
I think I knew it was going to be a long piece just because the topic was so complicated. And so, like, definitely outlining it took a while because we were like, how do we want to split up something like this? Like, how do we like fit all this information in? Because there's just so many different like aspects of psychedelics and its history. And so it was just like really difficult to think about like how long it should be and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, that's one thing that I really like about it. It flows really well considering you're packing in so much information. And just when like, you reading like a little of the history and say some stuff about therapeutic benefits, the reader might be like, but there's some controversies. And then it's like the next paragraph, you're like, and here's some controversies. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's really tremendous work. I wonder, yeah, are you uh getting feedback from the editors like the whole time? Are you getting regular feedback and kind of working on the organization together?
Yeah, I have a really close relationship with my editor at Atmos, Yesenia. She's great. And so yeah, we were able to like talk a lot, like outline process and just the interview process. I would send her little updates on like, what if I interview this person? Or like this person didn't respond to my email. We're gonna try this person. But I would say that's like kind of rare in
Hmm.
journalism. I got really lucky with Yesenia at Atmos, but yeah.
Nice. Very cool. Yeah, it's an interesting world to me, and I'm guessing I'm not alone as an academic or a scholar in kind of envying the world of like freelance journalism and that kind of writing, because it's just you're reaching a broader public,
Mhm.
And nothing against academics. It's important. Whatever we're doing is important too. But
Yeah, I interviewed so many academics for this story. Like, that's how just need like a journalist, like find your work.
yeah,
No
right. Yeah,
kidding.
that's the thing. Yeah, it's really the collaboration is really where all the magic happens.
Hmm.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I'll definitely put a link to the piece in the info for the episode. And I should say the artwork for it is also really beautiful. Did you have anything to do with that?
No, I had nothing to do with the
Yeah,
art.
I would figure not. Yeah, because they're like, no, we'll handle that.
Yeah, yeah, my editor
Uh,
did all of that.
nice. Uh, well, I'm curious, what else you got going on? Because obviously the psychedelics was just one thing among many. You have all these other pieces out, and really, environmental justice is the focus. I guess that's one of the things I really liked about the psychedelic piece is that it was an environmental justice writer talking about psychedelics, and not just a psychedelic advocate talking about environmental justice. Because they tend to just be really excited. It's like as long as enough people take mushrooms, we'll save the world, and that kind of thing. It's like settle down a little. So yeah, curious what's next for you, or do you have any projects you're currently working on?
Um, yeah, I am working on a lot of different projects right now. I don't know if I'm allowed to like say exactly what I'm working on right now. But they hopefully will come out soon because like similar to this article, I've been working on them for so long, so they better come out soon. And yeah, I guess I'm just sort of like freelancing more. I'm gonna be in Minnesota this weekend to attend a climate solutions series and maybe write some articles out of that. And I also just need to focus more on school. I need to like I'm a college student at UC Berkeley right now. I'm a freshman at Berkeley. So I just I need to focus more on school. I got very behind on my schoolwork while working on this article.
Yeah,
So
I would imagine that
yeah.
would take up a lot of time. What are you doing at Berkeley? What's your major?
My major is society and environment.
Oh, cool. Man, it's a great place to study environmental issues.
Hmm.
Yeah, because I'm not far from you. I teach at University of San Francisco, and that's generally my thing all the time. Is I'm like everybody, this is the place to study environmental stuff. Is the Bay Area, and UC Berkeley is just such a great reputation. So yeah, that's cool. Do your professors know that you are doing like freelance journalism?
One of my professors knows I do freelance journalism.
Are they
I don't
okay
know
with it,
about
or they're like, hey, focus on school?
I think they're fine about it. Yeah, I think they're really supportive of the journalism. But yeah, this is what I want to do after I graduate full time. So hopefully I
Nice.
can like, yeah.
Well, that's good. And good to hear that you're still, because I would think you'd be like, well, I'm kind of getting some success as a journalist. Why bother finishing my degree? And you're like, no, I'm going to stay and learn and do the whole degree. I appreciate that. Academia and like higher learning is kind of in a funk right now. There's a lot of people who've kind of lost trust in the system. But I, for one, obviously, I mean, professor, I'm obviously can advocate for it. But yeah, I appreciate that. It's an important part of what you're doing.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I don't know, one of the reasons I was also excited to invite you on is because you're clearly younger than a lot of our other interviewees. And it's the thing with scholarly stuff that tends to be older folks with often, gray hair and it's a very white industry as well. So academia definitely has a whiteness problem, but the oldness problem is one that gets me a lot. I love hearing young voices, especially knowing that that you got into all this initially in high school. You started caring about it. Like I think something really exciting is happening among the youth, and that maybe we haven't seen since like the '60s, where you see really like strong youth-led movements. So I don't know, makes me feel optimistic. And when you do environmental work or climate work, sometimes that's kind of rare.
Yeah. I will say like I feel like older people are better at podcasting than me. I think when I'm older I'll be better at podcasting.
I don't know. I think you're good. This has been fantastic. Yeah, I guess we'll leave it to the audience to judge. But but I think it was good. I'm not sure. It depends. People have different standards as to what counts as a good podcast, I
Mhm.
guess.
I
But
think the
just
older you
chatting
get
and
and like sorry,
oh
I
no,
cut
go
you off,
ahead.
but I was just saying like I think the older you get and the more established you get, the more confident you become when you're talking and being interviewed. So hopefully I can get better at that.
Yeah, confidence. I don't know. That can be a little overrated, though. I like spontaneity. I like sincerity. And at the end of the day, nobody really knows what's going on. And so it's nice to kind of admit, no, I don't have the full picture all the time. And, so, but yeah, I'm sure you'll just get better the more you do it, especially just because you're normally on the other side of the picture. You're doing the interviewing, you're not being interviewed. So I've had a couple other people on who've had that feeling. And they're like, oh, I don't like being interviewed. I like interviewing. And so somehow when
Mhm.
the tables are turned, it can be just very disorienting.
Yeah, I think that's what I like about journalism so much. Like I'm really like against centering myself in my writing. And it's really just about like these cool stories I find and yeah, that's like why I like journalism so much.
Nice. Well, geez, thanks so much for doing this, especially knowing that I basically put you in a position where we were going to center you in our discussion. Even the title of the podcast is Spotlights, right? We're just like putting
Yeah.
a spotlight on you. You're like, that's not, it's not really my thing.
No.
Uh, so yeah, so I really, really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll have to have you back on sometime because you're doing cool stuff, and I like hearing from a fellow Bay Area person. And um, but we'll do it, at a time when it won't interfere with school, and and yeah, after some more pieces come out or something, yeah, feel free come back and share what you're doing. This could be a practice ground. You'll get better at podcasts by hanging
Okay.
out with us a little bit.
Hopefully. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, and yeah, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it, and I certainly did. And we'll be back again soon with some more conversations for you. So in the meantime, take care and be well.